Good morning. Happy Easter. It's great to have you here. If you have your Bible, open with me to John chapter 20. If you're a guest with us for the first time, we'll also have the scriptures on the screen so you're not lost and you'll be able to read along as well, because we make everybody stand up and read. No, I'm just joking. John chapter 20. We've been in a series over the past few weeks. If you've been attending, we've been in a series called Jesus Died, and we've been looking at Jesus died to forgive us of our sins, and Jesus died to pay our debt. Last week, Pastor Daniel shared on Jesus died to defeat our enemies. And then this morning, we're going to look at, it's Easter Sunday, that Jesus didn't stay dead. Jesus came out of the tomb, and today Jesus lives, and that's awesome news. John chapter 20, verse 11 tells us that Mary stood outside the tomb crying. And as she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb and saw two angels in white seated where Jesus' body had been, one at the head and the other at the foot. And they asked her, "Woman, why are you crying?" "They have taken my Lord away," she said, "and I don't know where they have put him." At this she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not realize that it was Jesus. And he asked her, "Woman, why are you crying? Who is it that you are looking for?" Thinking he was the gardener, she said, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will get him." And Jesus said to her, "Mary." And she turned toward him and cried out in Aramaic, "Rabboni," which means teacher. And Jesus said, "Do not hold on to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father. Go instead to my brothers and tell them that I am ascending to my Father, and also to your Father, and to my God and your God." And Mary Magdalene went to the disciples with the news that I have seen the Lord. That really is Easter Sunday, isn't it? That I have seen the Lord. You know, in Washington, D.C., if you've ever been there before and gone around our nation's capital, between the Capitol building and the Lincoln Memorial is a stretch of black granite, and it's a V-shaped stretch of black granite that's about 246 feet long. It's called the Vietnam Memorial, and it was erected back in 1982. More than 3 million people visit it every year. It has more than 58,000 names of those who gave their life for our freedom in the Vietnam War. Christy and I have been there several times and seen it. We've walked up and touched that black granite and touched the names of those that gave their life. And it really is a very awe-inspiring experience to be there and to see it and see loved ones who reach out and loved ones who end up there and just trying somehow to make a connection. And one tourist told the story of being there in D.C. and leaving his hotel and going out for a morning jog, and it was raining in the morning, and he was jogging down that mall area towards the Capitol building. He all of a sudden found himself engulfed right there at the Vietnam Memorial with all these names. And if you've been there, you know that it starts out at about 8 inches, and at its apex where it meets in the middle, where the two granite slabs meet in the middle, it's over 10 feet tall. And he said, "I just stood there overcome with all of these names." He said, "I looked down to the side of me and noticed a woman in a yellow raincoat. And she stood there weeping. She stood there reaching out, touching the name of a loved one who had passed away. And also standing there looking, and we've seen many of these same artifacts, people that come and leave little mementos or things hoping somehow to make a connection, whether it's a ball glove or flowers or a pair of boots, or maybe it was an old hat that someone once had. But the problem with it is that nobody ever picks up the glove. Nobody ever picks up the flowers. Nobody ever picks up the old boots. There's that place where we reach out, where somehow we want to know that there's life after death, that there's something more to just what we have right here. And most people have stood at that place trying to make a connection with the past, or trying to make somehow a connection between the living and the dead. And that's really the story that we have here that we just read a couple of moments ago. It's the story of Mary Magdalene. She stood at the tomb. She stood there trying to make that contact, having just seen Jesus a few days prior and having seen him die on the cross. She gets up early that Easter, first Easter Sunday. She didn't even realize. She had no concept of what Easter was or what it meant or what that would be or what would even happen that day. But earlier in this chapter it says that she made her way to the tomb, and while it was still dark, she actually saw that the stone had been rolled away, and she ran back and told the disciples, and Peter and John who's writing the story, they actually run to the tomb, and Peter goes running inside the tomb. John stoops over and looks and notices that Jesus isn't there, and he automatically believes. He believes that Jesus has been resurrected, but they both run back to the house, and the Bible tells us right here in verse 11 that Mary, though, she finally arrives. They run on ahead of her, but Mary arrives at the tomb, and Mary stands there weeping bitterly. That word in the Greek, and the New Testament was written in Greek, and sometimes we don't get the full language in the English because we don't have all the English words to describe the Greek translation. And that word to weep, it actually meant that she stood there sobbing uncontrollably. And I'm sure that there were all kind of emotions that were running through her mind, and all kind of things that she was thinking about and trying to rehearse and trying to figure out, how do I deal with this in life? What do I do with an empty tomb? And see, she wasn't thinking resurrection at the time. She was just thinking to herself, somebody has stolen his body. I've come here and I've wanted to make a connection between the living and the dead, but what do I do with this information now? How do I deal with this? And you got to understand that Mary had hung her hat on Jesus being the Messiah. The Bible tells us in Luke chapter 8 that Mary Magdalene was a woman who 7 demons had been cast out of when she met Jesus. Now, 7 is the number of completion in the Bible, so that tells me that Mary, prior to meeting Jesus, she was a perfect devil. This was not the lady that you wanted to move in the neighborhood. This was the lady that before she met Jesus, that you would have said to your kids, make sure you don't go anywhere near that woman, she's crazy. She was that kind of person. That had been her life. Oppressed, possessed by the enemy. And yet Jesus had so radically changed her life. And there's been such radical transformation. She went everywhere with Jesus. She was there when Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead. She was just always present. She was always listening and serving and helping. But now, it had been 3 days and she's just left in complete turmoil. She's just left in complete and utter despair. What do you do? Jesus, I had hung all my hopes on him. Everything that I had put on this guy, Jesus. He's the closest friend that I have. What do I do now? Completely hopeless. And here's the thing that I know, that 2,000 years later, I may not have known exactly what, she was experiencing in that exact same situation, but I understand hopelessness. Many of you that are here today, you know what it means to be hopeless. We've all had feelings of hopelessness before. We've all had those feelings of hopelessness. Maybe it's in financial ruin. Maybe years ago you might have suffered. Maybe you're in a place right now where you might be suffering financial ruin. And you feel the hopelessness of the situation. Maybe you've lost everything. How do I move forward? What do I do with this? Maybe it's been in a marriage. Maybe you had a marriage that ended in divorce. Maybe you're in a marriage right now that you're struggling. And it didn't turn out the way you thought it was going to be, and you're left standing there with feelings of hopelessness. How do I move forward in life? Everything that I had was wrapped up in this marriage. Everything that I had was wrapped up in this relationship, and there just seems to be a death there. Maybe you've stood like I have at the bedside of people who were about to pass away. People that were getting ready to take their last breaths, and maybe you stood there with family members, moms and dads, brothers and sisters. You reached out and you took their hand, and at the last moment you were there when they took their last breath. How do you deal with the hopelessness of that? How do you deal with the hopelessness when you get a call from the police station and you hear, your son or your daughter's been arrested? Or you get the news that your kids are on drugs, and you have these feelings as a parent of hopelessness. How do I deal with these feelings of hopelessness? And here is Mary. She's dealing with all these emotions. All these things are inside of her, stirring around. All these feelings of hopelessness that she's struggling with and that she's dealing with. And all of a sudden it says this. It says that as she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb. And when she bent over to look in the tomb, it says that she saw 2 angels in white seated where Jesus' body had been, one at the head and the other at the foot. And they asked her, "Woman, why are you crying? Why is it that you're crying? I don't know about you, but if I hadn't seen anybody enter into the tomb and then all of a sudden I would have looked in the tomb, that would have scared me to death." But we don't see any fear from her. We just see the hopelessness. But it would scare me to death. And then it says in verse 14 that she turned around and she saw Jesus standing there. Listen how cool this is. She turned around and she saw Jesus standing there, but she did not realize that it was Jesus. She did not make the connection. She turns around and the very person that she's looking for is standing right in front of her, but she doesn't make the connection. She doesn't realize that it's Jesus. How do you not realize that it's Jesus standing in front of you? I mean, you've spent all this time with him. I mean, surely Mary would know that this is Jesus, but for whatever reason, and we're not given all the full details of this, but for whatever reason, she didn't recognize him. Now, have you ever gone through life, or maybe you've been involved in different points of your life where you just get really focused? I'm a type A personality, and when I get my mind set on something or I get moving in a direction, I mean, I kind of tune everything else out. And the downside to that, gift, if you would call it that, the downside is that sometimes I might tune people out, people around me, because I'm so fixated on what my mission is and so fixated on what I'm supposed to be doing that sometimes the people around me, I don't even recognize them. There have been plenty of times that I've talked to people in the lobby and shaken hands and hugged necks and different things like that, and I've had people come by me and they've patted me on the back or they've reached out to grab me, and I might be in a conversation with somebody, and because I'm fixed on the conversation that I'm having, or I'm really focused on a particular thing that I'm doing, I sometimes haven't noticed them. And then they get their feelings hurt and they're sad. Well, Pastor Ed didn't mention it. So let me just say this. If you come by me and you say, well, I didn't notice you, it's not because I'm mad at you, okay? Let me just go ahead and settle that with you right now. But we all have done that. We've all got involved in situations and in conversations or things that are happening in life where we forget about the things that are happening around us. And Mary was in that place. She was so fixated and she was so zeroed in on her hopelessness and her despair and her sorrow and what she was dealing with that she wasn't even able to see Jesus standing right in front of her. That's one of the things that happens in our lives when we allow our circumstances and our challenges to be bigger than Jesus. What ends up happening is we end up living with spiritual blindness. Maybe you're here today, and there's a degree of spiritual blindness that you're dealing with. And you say, well, Pastor Ed, I don't even understand that term. What do you mean by spiritual blindness? Well, the Bible talks about this in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 4. Paul said this, the Apostle Paul, he said that the God of this age, or talking about Satan or the devil, that the God of this age has blinded the mind of unbelievers so that they're unable to see Christ. There are people all across America today. I'm so grateful that every single one of you got up and you came today on Resurrection Sunday. I'm so grateful, but there are people all across our community, all across America, all throughout the world today, that on such a big day where we celebrate the resurrection of Jesus, they'll never darken the doors of the church because the God of this age has blinded them. He's blinded them to what real truth is. And see, the enemy, you know what the enemy does? The enemy is the master of illusion. He's the master of illusion, of smoke and mirrors. I was at this one big, kind of illusion magic show one time a couple years ago, and I remember seeing the magician, and he's doing all the things, and you're just standing there, and you're really just dumbfounded, thinking to yourself, how is he doing that? How is that happening? How is that taking place? How is he able to do that? How did he make that disappear? How did he make that woman, how did she get sawn in half, and then she's back? How is all that happening? But you realize it's just all illusion, but it looks so real. And the enemy comes along and he brings things and he makes them look so real to us, especially when it comes to areas of religion. When it comes to areas of religion, he tells us things, or he brings these illusions to us to get us to try to believe things that aren't really true. Things like, all religions, they all lead to the same God. Well, it's just one big mountain, and God is at the top of that mountain, and it doesn't really matter what path you follow. It's the same God, whether it's Hinduism or Buddhism or New Age, or whether it's Islam or Christianity or whatever. Maybe you're just agnostic and you're just kind of climbing that belief of no belief mountain. But the enemy, he's a master at trying to get people to think that it's all the same. It's all okay. It's just all the same. It all leads to the same path. But it's a lie. It's a lie, because we're here today celebrating the resurrection, and if we believe, and we fully believe, listen to me, that if Jesus Christ was raised from the dead, then it doesn't leave room for the philosophy or the idea that all roads lead to the same God, because Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father except through me. That's what he said. I didn't say it. You can't get upset at me. I didn't say it. Jesus said it. And I believe the truth of the Word of God, and I resist the lie. I resist the lies of the enemy. I resist the things. And you say, well, how do we know that the resurrection is true? Because listen, if the resurrection is really true, and we're here today celebrating the resurrection, because I would hope that you wouldn't come today just to celebrate a lie. I mean, we're here today for a purpose, aren't we? We're here today because there is something inside of us. There is something that we feel inside that says there's more to this thing, Christianity, than Jesus who just died on a cross, or this moral leader, or this great teacher, this great philosopher who died on the cross. There's more on the inside of me, because if he was just a moral teacher and just a good guy and this great philosopher and this really good humanitarian that did great things for people, and he died and he stayed in the tomb, then what we're doing here today is we're celebrating some big false lie. What kind of people does that make us? Makes us pretty stupid. But we're here today because we know for a fact, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that Jesus was raised from the dead. And you say, how do we know that Jesus was raised from the dead? I'm glad you asked me that question. Do you realize that post-resurrection, that after Jesus was raised from the dead by his Father, by God, that more than 500 people saw him? You can find this in the New Testament. More than 500 people saw Jesus. Do you realize that that would stand up in any court of law as fact? If you had 500 people, both those who followed him and those who didn't follow him, all testifying to the same thing. I saw Jesus. I reached out. I touched him. It's the same guy. That would be proof beyond any doubt whatsoever. And so we have great evidence. And think about this. Even the disciples, Jesus' closest followers, every single one of them, they had seen the risen Lord, and it had so changed their life. They had seen the truth of the risen Christ, and it had so changed their life that every single one of them, with the exception of Judas, who had betrayed Jesus and went out and hung himself, with the exception of Judas, every single one of those disciples ended up sealing their own testimony and their own story in their own blood by giving their life, because they had realized the importance of the resurrection and knew that Jesus was alive. Let me ask you this. How many people do you know that would die for a pile of bones? But they didn't, because they knew that Jesus was alive. And so for the enemy to come along and bring lies to us and say that there are all these different ways, and this is just one way to reach God, it's not the truth. And another spiritual blinder that the enemy puts on our lives and in us so many times is just simple pride. Thinking that we're the masters of our own demise. That we can figure it out, or we're kind of the masters of our own future, and we can make things happen for ourselves, and we can these spiritual matters and these things. Yes, there's something inside of me that says there's more, but I can take care of this on my own. And man, if I'm a good enough person and I can just do all the right things, and then I'm going to make it, I'm going to be okay. If I give to the Red Cross or the United Way, and anytime there's a national disaster or something like that, I help out a little bit, or I send a little money, or when it comes time to helping in the community, I might go out and help out at a food pantry or do this or that, or maybe I'll go to church on Easter or maybe on Christmas, and that's going to get me enough. People will realize that I'm a good guy or I'm a good woman, and I do good things, and that's going to be all I really need to make it in the afterlife. It's an illusion. It's an illusion. Because we're not saved based on our own good merit. We're saved and we're redeemed, the Bible says, because of what Jesus did. And what the resurrection, Jesus dying on the cross, we've talked about this in the last few weeks. Jesus died to give us forgiveness and to pay all of our sin debt. And what the resurrection does is it validates. It validates and it brings proof that Jesus is who he said he was. And if that's the case, then it changes everything in our lives. It changes everything. So maybe you're here today and you say, Ed, I'm just struggling with this whole idea. Here's what I want to challenge you to do. Just simply pray and say, God, if there's an area in my life where I'm blind and I'm not able to see you, help me to be able to see you. Now, I remember when I was 16 years old, I grew up in the church. But even growing up in the church, you would think, well, I'd be a good little church kid. No, I kind of got into my teen years, and as a teenager, I had a hard time understanding many of the concepts. I had a hard time seeing Jesus, even though I had sung all the worship songs, and I knew so much about the Bible. I knew so many different things. I just had such a difficult time connecting the dots. And it was because I was blind. When I was 16 years old, I remember giving my life to Christ fully. I remember making that decision to follow Jesus, and all of a sudden, things just came to life. Things began to change. It doesn't mean that I didn't have those ups and downs, because I still had those moments throughout my life. And from time to time, we all have those moments of hopelessness and despair like Mary, where we have a hard time recognizing Jesus. Just because we have a hard time recognizing him in our lives doesn't mean that he's not there. I sat in my car years ago, overcome with grief and unbelief, really struggling in some particular areas of my life. I remember sitting in my car until my hand just about became bruised. I sat beating on my steering wheel as hard as I could and screaming out in my car, God, where are you? God, where are you? If you're really real and you really exist, how come I don't see you? Where are you in my life? And I was at a place of that hopelessness where I wasn't able to see him. It didn't mean that he wasn't there, and it wasn't until later on that I was able to reflect back and realize that even in a critical moment like that, even in a time like that where I didn't sense where he was, that Jesus was sitting right there next to me, and that I didn't have eyes to be able to see him. And my guess is that there are people in the room here today, maybe you're struggling in your own place, struggling in your own ways, and you don't see where he is. I want to tell you that Jesus is here today. Jesus is here today. He's present. He's at work. He's living, and he's active. And so we see Mary, and she doesn't even realize that it's Jesus. And then Jesus does something kind of crazy in verse 15. Jesus says to her, "Woman, why are you crying? What is it that you're crying about?" Isn't it just kind of odd? Have you ever thought, it's just kind of odd that Jesus would ask this question. I did a series several years ago called The Questions of Jesus. Why is it that he asks questions? If he's all-knowing, he's omniscient, why is it that he asks questions from time to time? I think the reason that Jesus asked Mary this question is because he's trying to draw her out of her hopelessness. He's trying to get her eyes not on what she's going through and not on what she sees, but on what she doesn't see. He's getting ready to bring the big surprise to her. And you know what I've realized is that Jesus is at his best when life is at its worst. That's where Jesus does his best work, is when life is in the pits and your hopes end up in a tomb. When those things are happening, Mary's hopes are in a tomb. And that's in those moments that Jesus is over on the side planning a celebration. So wherever you are in your life, understand that Jesus doesn't look at your hopelessness the same way you do. He doesn't look at your grief. He doesn't look at your unbelief the same way you do. He sympathizes, he understands, but he sees celebration. He sees celebration. He sees the things that you are unable to see. Here she is just struggling, and I can even see Mary just wondering, do I really matter? How is all this taking place? I mean, I thought I really mattered, and I had believed everything that he said. And just in this short, critical moment, I mean, she says to Jesus, she says, can you tell me where he is? Matter of fact, if you've done something with him, let me know, I'll go get him. And Jesus looks at her and says these simple words. Simple word. Mary. Mary. He simply calls her name. Don't you love to hear your name? You know, there's some great books and articles out on how to lead and how to make friends, how to be a person of influence. It says one of the ways that you can become a person of influence, one of the ways that you can make friends, is by simply calling and using people's names when you talk to them. You know, we all want to hear our name. We all want to know that we matter. Nobody wants to be just a hey you, or hey buddy, or hey lady, or hey person. Nobody just wants to be a hey. We love to hear our names. What is it about hearing our names? You know, when we hear our names, and people use our name, and people say to me, hey Ed, do you know what that says to me? It says that I'm wanted. It says that somebody is interested in me. It says that I'm important. It says that they are giving me their full attention. They're asking, they're calling my name and willing to give me their full attention. And one of the biggest things, when people use my name, you know what I love about that? It means that I'm visible, that I'm there, that I'm recognized, that I'm important enough to be recognized. And here's Mary. Jesus simply, he doesn't shake his finger at her. He says, Mary, what are you doing? Why are you standing here weeping? Why are you standing here crying? Don't you remember what I told you last week? Didn't I tell you these things were going to have to happen? Don't you remember when I was teaching up on the mountainside? Don't you remember when this happened? I can't believe. How could you be filled with such unbelief? Why in the world? But Jesus doesn't approach us that way. He doesn't come to us today to try to beat us over the head and tell us all the things that we've done wrong, or, well, you shouldn't be living this way. You shouldn't be feeling this way. You shouldn't be experiencing this. He comes along today to simply call us by name. Mary, in that quick moment, I love what it says. She turned and she cried out to him, Rabboni. Rabboni, she says, which means teacher. In that split second, all of a sudden, hope turned to hope. Hopelessness turned to hope. Grief turned to joy. She was able to see the Lord. That's what I love about the resurrection, is that the living, breathing Jesus, who gave his life 2,000 years ago for every single one of us today, came out of a tomb. And he's living and breathing. Now fast forward 2,000 years, living and breathing and active in this room today. He's here. He's right here. So how do we see him? How do we see him? Well, it's real simple. You may not have picked up on this, but there's one word that's used in two places here, in verse 14 and verse 16. It says that Mary turned. She was looking at the tomb. She had gone inside of it. She saw the two angels, but she was so fixed on her despair. She was so zeroed in on her hopelessness and on her grief and all the feelings and all the emotions that were stirring up inside of her. But it says that Mary turned. Mary turned towards Jesus. See, if you're feeling hopelessness and you're feeling all these raw emotions in your life, trying to figure out how you're going to move forward or how to deal with certain areas of your life or how to deal with your own spirituality, how do you deal with this message of Jesus coming back to life? How do I deal with all that? It's real simple. We just turn towards him. We turn towards Jesus. To turn towards Jesus means to turn towards hope. It means to turn towards life. It means to turn to a new beginning and a new start. To turn away from the old life, to turn away from the old things, to turn away from the past and to turn away from the hurts, to turn away from the sin, to turn away from the unbelief. And that's what she was doing. She was now turning away from the unbelief, now into a place of fully believing that Jesus is who he said he was. And Jesus is crazy. And Jesus says to her in the next verse, he says, I don't fully understand this. And he says these words. He says, don't cling to me because I haven't yet ascended to my Father. And I don't understand physically what that was about, and I've studied it, and I don't know. I'm not sure what it means. I can take a guess. I think there may have been something in this that when Jesus said, don't cling to me, that he was saying, Mary, things aren't going to be the way they used to be. See, she had seen Jesus in a certain way. She had seen Jesus physically with her at all times, and she had been there with Jesus and seen him preach and teach and share all the things about the kingdom. And now that Jesus is alive, she grabs onto him, and in essence, she's saying, I am never letting you go again. I'm never going to go through this again. I can never feel this pain again. I never want to go through these 3 days of sorrow that I felt. I never want to come back to another tomb wondering if you're there or not there. I never want to deal with this again. I'm always going to hold on to you. I am never, just so you know, Jesus, I am never letting you out of my sight again. But Jesus says to her, don't cling to me because things aren't going to be the way they used to be. There's a new beginning. There's a new way. As a matter of fact, he said, I've got to ascend. I've got to go to my Father. And Jesus didn't even share this. He said, I've got to go to my Father because it's more important for me to go, because if I go, then the Holy Spirit will come. And the one that you are looking to cling to, the one that you are looking to hold on to, the one that you are wanting to stay with and never leave you, that's the person in me that's going to come. And he is always going to be with you. You will always have him there to cling on to for all of your life. He'll always be there. And when we turn to Jesus, that's the way life is. Things will never be the same. Some of you are here today, and you need to turn to Jesus. You need to turn from your hopelessness. You need to turn from your pride, thinking that you know the way, thinking that you have this whole life thing figured out, because there's a reason why you're here today, and I don't believe it's by any accident. I believe that it's God ordained, that God had your name on today's date on His calendar, that today's a special day for Him, that He's got circled because it's the day that He's here to call you by name. Maybe you've been trying to figure it out your own way and trying to do all the things yourself. Figure out your own way to meet God or find God or see God. And the reason is because you know intrinsically that deep down inside, something's off. Something is not right. There is an internal moral compass that we all have that apart from God tells us something's not right. Something's not right. But the resurrection brings those things that aren't right and makes them right. Because it brings answers to the questions. It brings hope to the hopelessness. It brings joy to the grief. I love the story of the resurrection. I love the truth of the resurrection. And one of the greatest truths of the resurrection that we're celebrating here today is that death is not final. There's going to be a moment where every single one of us in the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years, most people here will, in a hospital bed or maybe at home or in a facility somewhere we're going to take that last breath. And when we take that last breath, we call that death. But because of the resurrection, that's not the final word. That in that split second, when we take that last breath, and we take our last physical breath, that in that split second, all of a sudden, we leave this world and we are transformed into a new place where we are made alive in Christ. Because of the resurrection. Death doesn't have the final say-so. And let me tell you, in your hopelessness, and in your grief, and in your sorrow, death does not have the last word. Death is not final. It's not fatal. And I love the resurrection because it's also a story of new beginning. It's a story of new life. If you're here today and you knew new life, it's a story of new life. It's a story that the last chapter of my life has not been written. As a matter of fact, the story of the resurrection is not even that I'm writing another chapter in my book. The story of the resurrection is today is a brand new book that is being written about my life. Today is chapter 1. Today is introduction of a brand new story that is being written of my life. And as I just even begin to kind of forecast out and look forward into this great story that God is going to start writing in my life today, as I look, there's a chapter towards the conclusion of that book that says this, it's titled, "The Best Is Yet to Come." And because of the resurrection, that is the truth. The best is yet to come. That whatever's happened in life, the best is yet to come. That this isn't all there is. The best is yet to come. And for Mary, it wasn't just the hopelessness, it wasn't just the grief. Through Jesus, the best was yet to come. And even for her standing there, seeing the risen Savior physically, He was still able to look at her and say, "Mary, this isn't all there is. There's more to come. There's so much more." And for you in your life, we call it a blessed assurance. A blessed assurance. It's an assurance, a confidence we have in our lives regarding who Jesus is. The claims of Christ, the resurrection, it's a confidence that we have as followers of Jesus that internally tells us that the best is yet to come. I can see Mary as she walked away that day. Jesus said, "Go back and tell the brothers, go back and tell the disciples that I'm risen, that I'm going to my Father and your Father, my God and your God." She goes back and she says to them, "I have seen the Lord." And I can just see her as she walks back, or as she probably runs back, all these new emotions that are filling her, all these new things that are stirred up in her life. And I'm just wondering that even as she ran back that day, if some words similar to this song might have been stirring around in her heart. Listen to this.